This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. If you love documentaries, look out for more about them later on in the video. It's well worth the wait. The man known to history as Amon Goeth was born as Amon Leopold Goeth on the 11th of December 1908 in Vienna, which at the time was the capital of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was Amon Franz Goeth, the owner of the Viennese publishing house Verlaganstalt Amon Franz Goeth. The company specialized in military books, but also sold religious publications and postcards. It did quite well, and as a result, the younger Amon was born into an upper-middle-class family of the Vienna business community. Amon's mother was Bertha Schwendt Goeth. He was the couple's only child, and as such, he could look forward to a comfortable life given his family's prosperity. Young Amon was afforded a good education for the time. He was sent to an upper-middle-class Catholic school in Vienna, and would eventually attend the Weidhoven an der Thaya College, close to what today is the Czech border. This was an agricultural college, which Goeth began attending when he was still in his mid-teens. But despite the affluence of the Goeth family, Amon's childhood was troubled in its own way. Amon Franz Goeth often traveled for his work, sometimes very widely, in an effort to open up new markets for the publishing house's books and other printed material. Back in Vienna, the day-to-day labor of actually managing the office and its employees consequently fell to Bertha Goeth, and so, with both his father and mother largely indisposed, Amon was largely raised by his aunt. This, combined with being an only child, left him somewhat isolated, but also resentful of his parents. Thus, the beginnings of the bitter, savage man that would later emerge were already making themselves felt when Amon was just a teenager. Years later, he would reflect on this to his mistress in Poland, Ruth Irena Calder, who noted in an interview in 1975 that Amon felt as though his parents had neglected him. We are fortunate to know extensive details about Goeth's earlier life, not because he kept a diary or composed a memoir, such as is the case with some other senior Nazis such as Joseph Goebbels and Albert Speer, but because there is an extensive file on Goeth in the Bundesarchiv Berlin Documentation Center. This was compiled by the Schutzstaffel or SS, the Nazi Party paramilitary organization, which Goeth would subsequently join, and includes statements by Goeth himself about his youth and early adult years. Supplementing this are the extensive details about Goeth's wartime record and war crimes, which was produced as part of his trial after the conflict, and which gives further extensive details on his actions in the 1930s and 1940s. This contains first-hand accounts by some of those who witnessed Goeth's actions during the Second World War. And all of this is supplemented by accounts by individuals who would eventually escape from the concentration camp in Poland, which Goeth ended up commanding. Furthermore, the interview which his former mistress, Ruth Irena Calder, gave in 1975 to the Israeli historian Tom Segev is a very useful personal account of Goeth's views, although probably biased in many respects. As a consequence, we are able to develop a more detailed picture of Goeth's life and actions during the war than we otherwise would be able to for a good many of the other commandants of the concentration camps. Goeth's childhood years were spent in a country which was mired in war. For years, the major European powers had been aligning themselves into two armed camps, driven by a wide range of forces, including colonial rivalry, regional conflicts in areas such as the Balkans, and rivalry particularly between Britain and Germany. The Empire of Austria-Hungary, in which Goeth was born and grew up, was mainly concerned in this maelstrom with the Balkans, where it was vying with Tsarist Russia for influence as the Ottoman Empire collapsed. However, the government in Vienna was also concerned about the increasing nationalist movements amongst peoples such as the Croats and Serbs. In the summer of 1914, a Serb nationalist assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and the crisis which ensued in the weeks that followed eventually spiraled into a European-wide war between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side and Britain, France and Russia on the other. Eventually others would involve themselves until it became a global conflict. The First World War would last until 1918, with Britain and France finally emerging as the main victors. At its conclusion, the German Empire collapsed, and a new republic named after the town of Weimar was created, while the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismembered, with major regions such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia acquiring their independence from a new, smaller state of Austria. Goeth began to rebel against his social and familial background in his late teens. He would later claim that he did so in order to turn his back on the bourgeois social values which his parents had tried to instill in him. They wished for Amon to be educated in a way that would prepare him for taking over the publishing business one day. But although Amon was clearly an intelligent student, he showed little commitment to his work and eventually dropped out of the agricultural college he attended at Weidhoven after just a few months. Rather, Goeth was more interested in athletics and physical activity, and, more concerning, was an interest he had developed in politics during his few months in college. In 1925, when he was still just 17 years of age, he joined the youth chapter of the Austrian branch of the National Socialist Workers' Party, a pan-Germanic party which had been established in Germany in the aftermath of the First World War. The Nazi Party, as it was commonly known, was committed to the idea of reversing the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended the war, creating a strong Greater Germany, and fighting against the perceived influences of the Jewish people and communists in Germany and surrounding nations. Headed by a fellow Austrian called Adolf Hitler, they had attempted a military insurgency in Munich in November 1923, and were thereafter regarded as an extremist party in both Germany and Austria. Goeth had been drawn to the Nazi Party for a number of reasons. Many Austrians were interested in Nazism owing to its insistence that the peace terms offered to Germany and Austria in the aftermath of the First World War were overly punitive, and most historians today agree that the treaty terms were indeed overly harsh and created severe economic problems in these countries. But Goeth, with his interest in sport and athletics, was also attracted by the party's emphasis on the physicality of the German people and their martial and sporting prowess. Its associations, such as the youth branch of the party, also fostered camaraderie, and for an individual who had been raised as an only child and had distant parents, the Nazi Party perhaps offered the promise of some companionship. But if these were some of the more benign things which attracted Goeth, there were also less positive aspects to his liking of the party. He was openly anti-Semitic and possessed of racial hatred towards the Jewish people. This was made clear in 1927 when, while having returned to Vienna to work in his parents' publishing house, he joined the Styrian Home Protection Organization, a rabidly anti-Semitic branch of the Austrian Home Guard, another fascist group operating in the country at the time. Goeth continued to work for some time with his parents in Vienna, but without undergoing the sort of academic training which would have prepared him to succeed his father as head of the firm one day. It was clear he viewed his position there at the time as a temporary employment, which he would possibly move on from. It was in Vienna in 1930 that he became caught up in a power struggle within Austrian fascism. Following the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the Great Depression which followed it, the Nazis had moved from being a fringe party with the support of little more than 5% of the German people to quickly becoming a major force in German politics. As they did, the Austrian branch of the party sought to consolidate its hold over Austrian fascism by forcing the Austrian Home Guard and other groups to merge with them. This did not succeed, and the Nazis now decreed that Austrian members could not also be members of the Home Guard. Goeth was aligned with both, but tied his flag to the Nazi Party after some deliberation. Accordingly, in May 1931, Goeth, who until this time had remained a member only of the youth wing of the Nazis, became a full member, number 510,764. This would later qualify him as an old fighter, a party member who had joined before January 1932. Once he had become a fully fledged member of the party, Goeth's involvement in its various branches and organizations became more extensive. For instance, he had become a member of the SA, the Sturmabteilung or Brown Shirts, a paramilitary wing of the party which wore brown shirts as their military uniform. Members participated in military drills and parades as part of Nazi militaristic activity, and it was possible through his initial involvement with the SA that Goeth developed an interest in the more hardline branch of the Nazis, the Schutzstaffel or SS, meaning protection squad, which was, like the SA, a paramilitary grouping within the Nazi Party. It was originally established as a small bodyguard unit for Hitler. However, unlike the SA, the SS placed an overt emphasis on the racial ideology of the Nazis, particularly so after Heinrich Himmler became the new head of the organization in 1929. Himmler's appointment also saw a massive increase in the size of the SS, from just hundreds of men to thousands and eventually tens of thousands. Goeth had seemingly applied to become a member of the SS in 1930, but his application was only accepted in 1932 when he became the 43,673rd member of the organization. It would be a fateful association, as the SS would in time become the body which orchestrated the worst of the Nazis' war crimes across Europe. 1933 was a significant year for both Goeth and the Nazi movement overall. As the economic situation had deteriorated in Germany in 1931 and 1932, the Nazis had risen to become a major force in German politics. Elections to the Reichstag in 1932 confirmed them to be the leading party in the country, while still only able to command just over one-third of the vote. The Communists, regarded as their ideological opponents, were the second strongest performing party, and so Germany was now engaged in a tussle between the right-wing Nazis and the left-wing Communists. Eventually, the Nazis won out, as the center-right leaning business community in Germany decided to back Hitler early in 1933. He became Chancellor, and within weeks a dictatorship was established through an enabling act which allowed the Nazis to rule by decree. For Goeth in Austria, the implications of this centered on the response of the Austrian government. It was concerned by the rise of the Nazis and the party's call for a greater Germany. Consequently, in 1933, it began cracking down on the Nazi movement in the country and eventually prohibited the party entirely on the 19th of June 1933. Goeth, who was already being sought for engaging in terrorist activities around Vienna on behalf of the party, fled Austria and relocated to Germany later in the year. Goeth now followed the exodus of senior members of the Austrian Nazi Party, who were streaming north over the Austrian border with Germany towards Bavaria and the city of Munich, where Hitler and the main leaders of the German Nazi Party had risen to prominence a decade earlier, and he quickly established himself here within a sort of Austrian Nazi Party in exile, one which sought to continue to disseminate the Nazi message throughout Austria from southern Germany. Goeth's specific involvement was trying to use the new medium of radio to broadcast Nazi programs and messages over the airwaves which could be picked up on in Austria. And he was also working during this time as a courier for the SS, moving between Germany clandestinely over the Austrian border. It was this activity which led to him being arrested in October 1933, as the Austrian government of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss was trying to purge Austrian society of its Nazi element, a campaign which saw some 50,000 Austrian Nazis incarcerated by April 1934. Goeth was not among them though, as he was released in the final days of 1933 owing to a lack of evidence and returned to Germany. Our understanding of Goeth's activities in the months and years that followed is aided by the interview Goeth's mistress Ruth Irene Calder gave in 1975. She noted how Amon continued his activities with the Austrian Nazi Party in exile following his return to Germany, but his brief arrest and imprisonment late in 1933 did not deter him from making further forays over the border into Austria in 1934, as the politics of his home country was becoming increasingly turbulent. In an effort to suppress the Nazis, Chancellor Dollfuss increasingly cemented a brand of Austro-fascism distinct from that of the Nazis, and after an attempted uprising by the Nazis in February 1934, he established a new constitution which gave himself near dictatorial powers. However, he would not live long to exercise them. On the 25th of July 1934, Dollfuss was assassinated by a squad of nearly a dozen Austrian Nazis in the Chancellery building in Vienna. and it seems clear that Goeth had played a part in the planning of the assassination. Moreover, he was one of several thousand Austrian Nazis who were detained in the country in the weeks that followed, but somehow he managed to escape from custody and yet again fled over the border to safety in southern Germany. It was a near escape, one which might have otherwise led to a lengthy jail sentence or even his execution. In the aftermath of the failed Nazi coups in Austria in the spring and summer of 1934, a new government emerged there under Kurt Schuschnigg, which maintained Dollfuss's anti-Nazi stance with greater success in the mid-1930s. As a result, many of those Austrian Nazis who had been attempting to seize power in Austria by operating from Germany resigned themselves to the fact that this would not be possible for some time. Accordingly, from late 1934, Goeth began to focus on advancing within the ranks of the SS in Germany by finding a position at Dachau concentration camp, which had recently been established in Bavaria to detain political prisoners. However, he temporarily left the organization just a few months later when he fell out with his immediate commander, Alfred Bigler. This was a time during which the Austrian members of the SS declined quite considerably, following the failure to establish control over their native land. Consequently, in the mid-1930s, Goeth turned for some time to working for his family's publishing business to handle its activities in Germany. He also married shortly after settling fully in Germany to Olga Janoschek, a woman who was recommended to Goeth by his parents who knew her family. But the marriage was immediately troubled and they divorced within just a few months. Amon's years in exile from Austria in Germany in the mid-1930s coincided with a period during which the Nazi state was becoming increasingly belligerent on the European stage. It had always been the intention of Hitler and his followers to overturn the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Accordingly, from their first seizure of power in 1933, a gradual rearmament began throughout Germany. Then, in March 1936, the Rhineland region was remilitarized. Under the terms of Versailles, this region was to remain strictly empty of German armed forces in order to prevent any future buildup of power along the French border and the border with the Low Countries. The Allied powers, though, were willing to appease Hitler in this respect, as the area had been demilitarized for nearly 20 years. Yet it was also the first sign of a strategy of appeasement by Britain and France, which was to prove catastrophic in the years that followed. Additionally, a new German air force called the Luftwaffe had been established under the command of Hermann Göring. This newfound belligerence and rearmament spoke of a willingness by Hitler and the Nazis in Germany to increasingly confront its neighbors and the main victors of the First World War, Britain and France. This would soon have consequences for Austria and for Goeth. Goeth was relatively inactive between his moving away from the SS between late 1934 and early 1937, as he largely continued working for his parents' company from within Germany. First signs that he had returned to being an active Nazi and SS member came in the summer of 1937, when he wrote a letter to the headquarters of the Austrian Refugee Society in which he requested the transfer of his Nazi Party membership number from Austria to Munich. The timing of this is significant. Throughout 1937, political pressure was again being employed by the Nazis to try to bring Austria under its control. By the summer of that year, Hitler was determined to annex Austria and was offering renewed support to a resurgent Austrian Nazi movement. In response, Kurt Schuschnigg's government in Vienna tried to crack down again on these initiatives by mass arrests of Austrian Nazis, but this had a limited effect. Accordingly, on the 9th of March 1938, he called a referendum on the issue of unification with Germany, hoping that a victory in this vote would shore up support for the government. But what the result might have been in a fair election is difficult to determine. Before it could ever be held, Hitler ordered the German 8th Army to cross the border into Austria. Under the German occupation, the referendum was held on the 10th of April and passed by a clearly manipulated vote of 99.7%. The Anschluss, or union, had finally come about.
Thanks to our sponsor, CuriosityStream, the #1 brand in entertainment for people who want to know more. Curiosity Stream is the place for true storytelling, as they provide diverse content, telling true life stories without sensationalizing the topics. We've been watching Secrets of the Third Reich and can recommend the episode Deadly Missions. It's about behind enemy lines missions which took place in secret away from the front lines. It's definitely worth a watch if you enjoy history content that tells it like it is. Another great history documentary we found was The Amazing Story of Pompeii, the mystery of the people frozen in time. It was an amazing story and so well told. You will also find lots of other amazing documentaries on subjects such as science, food, technology, travel, as well as nature. There are 35 collections of programs which you can stream to your device to view at your leisure. There are also award-winning exclusives and original content you won't find anywhere else. Curiosity Stream is the Disney Plus for the scientist in us. Go to the video description now and click the link to sign up for just $14.99 for the whole year.
This union of Austria with Germany was a triumphant moment for Goeth. He could now return to his native Austria, and duly did so within days of the Anschluss occurring, and he was now under pressure to marry quickly. The SS had a rule which the head of it, Heinrich Himmler, had promulgated, that all SS men between the ages of 25 and 30 were required to get married and start a family. This directive was issued with the intention that these men, the supposed best of the Aryan race, would have numerous children which would go on to flood Germany and its dominions with ideal German citizens. Goeth was already 28 years of age and needed to settle down quickly to conform with this rule. Thus it was that he quickly established a relationship with Annie Geiger, a 23-year-old Austrian woman whom he had met at a motorcycle race. They were wed on the 23rd of October 1938, but not before passing a series of stringent physical tests and interviews set by the SS, and they would have 3 children in quick succession in the years that followed. Peter was born in 1939, but died in infancy. Werner arrived soon after in 1940, and Ingeborg appeared the following year. Goeth would have little contact with them, as Annie and the children spent most of the war, which was to follow, living in Vienna, while Goeth was stationed in Poland and elsewhere. Goeth's eagerness to abide by Himmler's directive for men of the SS of his age to marry and start a family was indicative of his newfound commitment to the organization in the aftermath of the German annexation of Austria. He now moved away from working with the family business again and committed himself fully to the SS. Much of this activity focused on the extension of the Nazi regime's brutal anti-Semitic policies into the newly acquired territory. The Nuremberg laws in Germany had earlier robbed the country's Jews of their citizenship and made them into second-class individuals in business and social terms. Now these were extended into Austria, and the persecution of the country's Jewish community began. The severity of it was particularly apparent during the Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass pogroms in November 1938, when Jewish homes and businesses all across Nazi Germany and Austria were destroyed, and thousands of Jews were either killed or seriously wounded. The attacks were particularly severe in Vienna, where most of the city's synagogues were burnt, as the capital's people and fire departments looked on and watched. No doubt Goeth was involved in some capacity, and by early 1939 he was serving in the SS Standarte 89, a group of highly organized shock troops in Vienna. It appears on a largely full-time basis, although he maintained some minimal links with the family publishing business. As Goeth was establishing his family in Vienna, the new German Third Reich was becoming ever more aggressive in its approach and willingness to test the patience of Britain and France. Following the union with Austria, Hitler almost immediately began making noises about the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia with a large population of ethnic German people living in it. Hitler insisted that if the Sudetenland was ceded to Germany, it would be the last claim he would make on territory in Europe. Taking the bait, the British and French agreed to this at a conference in Munich in September 1938. But it was nowhere near the end of Hitler's territorial ambitions. By the spring of 1939, he pressed forward again, effectively annexing the rest of Czechoslovakia and bringing Hungary into the German sphere of influence. By now the situation was clear, and the British and French insisted that any further aggressive action would result in a declaration of war. That duly followed when the German army invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Hitler's Germany. The Second World War had begun. Goeth was soon involved in combat. At the start of hostilities, he was transferred to the SS combat unit Sturmbahn 111, and on the 9th of March 1940, he was promoted by Himmler to serve as a Verwaltungsführer, or administrative leader, of a Sonderkommando, or special unit. These units would soon be centrally involved in the Nazis' war crimes, and after serving as the administrative leader in Upper Silesia for several months, Goeth was promoted again to become a technical sergeant and was stationed by now in Katowice, or Katowice in Upper Silesia in Poland. This was an area of western Poland on the Czech border, which was of major industrial significance to the Reich, being a huge producer of coal and iron. Consequently, in the early stages of the war, a strategy was being developed here to deport or otherwise remove much of the population and effectively colonize it with German settlers. Goeth was involved in this initiative during 1941, working as a financial officer and administrator within the office of the Reich Commissioner for the Consolidation of German Nationhood. His ardent commitment to this work was recognized when he was given a certificate of service by his commanding officer, praising his service and his commitment to Nazi ideology. Despite the recognition of his usefulness in Katowice, or perhaps because of it, Goeth would soon be employed in a somewhat different fashion. With the outbreak of war, the Nazi state's attitude towards the Jewish community had become more brutal. In the 1930s, the Nazis had begun persecuting its Jewish population through a series of anti-Semitic laws which stripped the Jewish people of their citizenship and through attacks on Jewish businesses. But much worse was to follow upon the outbreak of the war. There was now an unfolding policy of forced exile. The Jews of Central Europe, and in particular the huge Jewish population within Poland, would be brutalized until they agreed to leave the Nazi Reich altogether, while pogroms and killings of Jewish people increased. And things grew more radical still as the war effort expanded. In the spring of 1940, the Germans conquered Denmark and Norway, followed very soon after by France and the Low Countries. With its dominance of continental Europe largely achieved, the Nazis began considering the possibility of mass forced deportations or even massacres of the Jewish people, tens of thousands of whom were now being rounded up and forced into Jewish ghettos and a network of concentration camps which were being constructed across Central and Eastern Europe. Goeth would have been entirely familiar with the camp system from his time in Western Poland, but it took on an even more sinister hue in late 1941 and early 1942, when the Nazi regime determined that it would begin mass murdering Europe's Jews in the concentration camps, generally by gassing hundreds or thousands of people every day and immediately burning their corpses. The final solution, as it was termed, was adopted as Reich policy by Hitler and the other leaders in the summer of 1941, and news of its employment was relayed to a conference of senior Nazi administrators at Wannsee outside Berlin in January 1942. And Goeth was quickly involved in this sinister activity. In the summer of that year, he was reassigned to Lublin in eastern Poland, where he worked under Odilo Globocnik, himself an Austrian Nazi. Globocnik was charged with a senior role in constructing and expanding 3 concentration camps at Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, and rounding up and sending hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews to these camps, which would become some of the most horrific centers of the Holocaust, which was just commencing. In the months that followed, Goeth observed Globocnik's methods, which included a mix of severe brutality towards the Polish Jews being sent to these camps, and also a striking level of corruption. Globocnik used the inmates of the camps as mass slave labor, and he was siphoning off much of the profits from the work they performed to benefit himself. Goeth would follow these same practices himself before long. On the 11th of February 1943, Goeth was promoted again. It was a major elevation. He was to become commandant or governor, effectively, of a new concentration camp which was to be constructed at Płaszów on the site of an already existing smaller labor camp. His reputation preceded him. Already before he arrived, the Jewish people of Kraków knew Goeth as the bloody dog of Lublin. His behavior at his new station would more than justify that designation. Goeth's first task upon arrival was to see to the camp's construction on a 200-acre site which, to add insult to injury, was being built over 2 Jewish cemeteries. To facilitate this, on the 13th of March 1943, the Jewish ghetto in Kraków was liquidated, and the remaining Jewish prisoners from within it were moved to the new camp as slave laborers, though a significant proportion of the ghetto residents was simply killed on the spot or was sent to one of the death camps. The facility was quickly constructed at Płaszów using the newcomers, and within weeks it was a fully operational concentration camp. Upon its completion, Goeth delivered a speech to the camp's inhabitants in which he ominously stated, "I am your God." The concentration camp of Płaszów was not one of the foremost centers of the Holocaust, which eventually led to the mass murder of approximately 6 million Jews across Europe between 1941 and 1945, as well as the murder of hundreds of thousands of Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, and other groups which the Nazis wished to eradicate. That distinction lay with the major death camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau in western Poland and Treblinka, where hundreds of thousands of people were gassed to death, over 1 million alone in the case of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Rather, Płaszów was strictly a concentration camp, insofar as it was a source of slave labor, and a camp where people were held or concentrated for periods of time until they were shipped out to Auschwitz or one of the other death camps. There were no gas chambers or crematoria here, as there were at these more notorious death camps. As such, Płaszów was primarily a way station before Polish Jews were sent off to Auschwitz, while it also functioned to produce war material and other goods for the German war effort or civilian population back in Germany. Goeth was a particularly sadistic administrator in all of this. When he organized the deportation of trainloads of the camp's Jewish children to Auschwitz, he would refer to them as being sent to kindergarten. This is not to suggest that no deaths occurred at Płaszów. Many thousands died there. A large proportion of these fatalities occurred owing to the appalling conditions of the camp, where diseases such as typhus ran riot. Others simply died of a combination of malnutrition and being overworked. The average daily ration of food for the Jewish inmates consisted of just a few hundred calories, typically comprised of watery soup and stale bread. When this inadequate diet was combined with a punishing daily work schedule of between 10 and 14 hours of hard labor, the inmates could only last for so long before their physical condition began to deteriorate sharply. Some agreed to collaborate with the camp authorities and became guards in order to acquire a double ration of food. However, a greater proportion of the deaths at Płaszów were owing to pure brutality. Infringements of the camp's rules or any effort at insubordination or attempt to escape could result in an immediate execution. These were carried out in a staged fashion, much of the time with the goal of terrorizing the camp's inmates by having them witness the systematic shooting of those who had dared disobey the rules or would not work hard enough. Central to this brutality, Amon Goeth would often order mass shootings as an example to the entire camp. Others later testified that he would regularly find reason to shoot somebody before he had even had his breakfast. In the daytime, during which Goeth was often quite drunk, he would parade through the camp with his 2 dogs, Rolf, a Great Dane, and Ralph, an Alsatian, who were trained to viciously attack individuals. Occasionally, shots were fired out of the window of Goeth's villa, where he lived in the center of the camp, at workers which he had observed as working too slowly. If one member of a work team committed an offense, Goeth saw to it that everyone was punished, the most brutal instance being when he killed every 5th member of a team from which one individual had seemingly escaped. These murders were often carried out at Chujowa Górka, a large hill in the camp where it is estimated that between 8,000 and 12,000 people were murdered in the 18 months or so the Kraków-Płaszów was under the command of Goeth, or roughly 20 people per day. Unsurprisingly, the camp inmates were terrified of Goeth and often tried to hide when he walked about the camp. One survivor later testified that, "When you saw Goeth, you saw death." During Goeth's time at Lublin and the first months at Kraków-Płaszów, the war effort more broadly for Germany and its allies was turning sour. In the summer of 1941, Hitler had decided to abandon the campaign, which had been initiated against Britain the previous year, of forcing it to surrender through a naval blockade and a major bombing campaign. Instead, the Nazis turned eastwards once again and invaded the Soviet Union. At first, the war on the Eastern Front was incredibly successful. By the late autumn, the Wehrmacht had advanced near to Moscow and Leningrad and had captured vast swathes of territory in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, even considered negotiating a peace in which he would cede much of this captured territory to Germany. Yet he refrained from doing so, and as the bitter Russian winter set in, the German advance was stopped and hundreds of thousands of men began to freeze. By 1942, the Russians were pushing back, and a major victory in the southern city of Stalingrad in the autumn and winter of 1942 broke the deadlock. The Russians began pushing the Germans westwards in 1943. Moreover, the United States had entered the war in December 1941, and in the course of 1943, the Western Allies defeated the Italians and Germans in North Africa, and then opened a southern front in Europe in Italy. Defeat was now assured for the Nazis. Amon Goeth's activities at Kraków-Płaszów and the camp more generally are perhaps much more well known today for having involved Oskar Schindler. Schindler was a German industrialist who hailed from the Sudetenland region and had something of a dissolute early adulthood, being arrested for public drunkenness on several occasions in the early 1930s and flitting from job to job. In the mid-1930s, he became involved with the Nazi movement in Czechoslovakia and became an informant to the party as it tried to gain influence in the Sudetenland region. His role as a party intelligence officer continued even after the Sudetenland was annexed. He was rewarded for his party activity in 1939 when he was given an enamelware factory in Kraków, and it was in this capacity that he would become involved in the events at the Kraków-Płaszów concentration camp. Schindler's factory was steadily staffed with Jewish slave laborers from the camp in the early 1940s, as the number of Polish Jews being detained and imprisoned steadily increased. Thus, there is an irony in that an individual who would eventually come to save many of the Jews at Kraków-Płaszów was paradoxically a long-standing Nazi himself. Schindler became the mastermind behind the rescuing of approximately 1,200 of Kraków-Płaszow's Jewish inmates, and perhaps many more indirectly, made famous by the 1993 Steven Spielberg film. Although Jewish labor was used in his factory in Kraków, he did not treat his workers poorly like so many other factory owners throughout the Reich did. In fact, he was especially kind to them, as he began spending large proportions of his own income and accumulated wealth from the factory in order to obtain black market goods and supplies to better feed and care for the workers and their families. Most significantly, he attempted to save hundreds of individuals. Often this was accomplished by bribing SS officers in the camp to refrain from killing workers or having them sent to Auschwitz or to one of the other death camps. Later, when a decision was taken to begin scaling back the size of Kraków-Płaszów as the Russians advanced towards Poland, Schindler convinced Goeth to allow him to move his factory and its workers to Bronieniec in Czechoslovakia. Goeth agreed on the basis of economic necessity, but for Schindler, what it meant was that he saved the lives of roughly 1,200 Jewish inmates of the camp, whose names he allegedly added to a list which may or may not have existed. These people would otherwise almost certainly have been executed or sent to one of the death camps, as Kraków-Płaszów was wound down. Schindler accomplished his valiant work even in the face of an increasing level of terror at Kraków-Płaszów. By mid-1944, the camp's population had increased to its largest size. Originally, it had housed just roughly 2,000 inmates, but at its peak, some 25,000 people were detained there, overseen by approximately 630 guards. And this was also the most intense period of the Holocaust throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and a large proportion of the 150,000 Jewish people who transited through Kraków-Płaszów on their way to the death camps were sent through here in the spring, summer and autumn of 1944. Moreover, Goeth's behavior continued to cast a pall of fear around the entire camp. Morning parades were now a common feature of life there. One morning, Goeth shot a man for being too tall. He then urinated on him as he lay dying. Sometimes prisoners would escape executions, but be whipped severely for not working hard enough. As one prisoner, Josef Bau, later reflected, Goeth was a hideous and terrible monster who set the fear of death in people. He ran the camp through extremes of cruelty that are beyond the comprehension of a compassionate mind. The intensification of the brutal activities at Kraków-Płaszów was occurring as the war was slowly drifting into its final stages. By mid-1944, the Russians were advancing into Poland. Hitler's Italian allies had decided to denounce their own leader, Benito Mussolini, and formed a new government in Rome which sided with the Allies. However, Mussolini was soon rescued by a mission sent by Hitler to central Italy, and a pro-German government was established in northern Italy, initiating a civil war in Italy on the southern front. Then, in the summer of 1944, the Western Allies, led by the United States and Britain, but with significant support from Canada and other nations, opened a long-planned Western Front in France, following the D-Day landings in Normandy. In the late summer and autumn of 1944, these landings were followed by the liberation of Paris and several other major cities in the Low Countries. By the time the winter of 1944 set in, the Western Allies were preparing for the final push into Western Germany, while the Russians were beginning their military build-up in Poland for a strike on Berlin in the spring of 1945. While the Russians advanced ever westwards, the camps in eastern Poland were beginning to be wound down and dismantled in the summer and autumn of 1944. For instance, on the 6th of August 1944 alone, Goeth shipped 7,500 Jewish women to Auschwitz, and just 4 days later over 4,500 Jewish men were sent to the Mauthausen concentration camp. This reduced the population of the camp to about half its size. However, Goeth had departed from Kraków-Płaszów before it was ever fully closed. By the summer of 1944, his conduct in running the camp was being investigated by the SS. Despite his supposed ideological adherence to the Nazi cause, Goeth had actually been profiting enormously from his role as commandant of Kraków-Płaszów. There was big money to be made in running one of the slave labor camps. Factories produced huge amounts of goods which, if siphoned off and sold on the black market, could result in a rich reward. Additionally, as inmates arrived to any of the concentration camps, they were generally stripped of their remaining possessions. Sometimes, valuable items of jewelry and gold and silver watches were found, and these were often claimed by the senior camp administrators as their own private loot. Such avenues of profit were exploited at most camps. Amon Goeth was no exception in profiteering from his time as commandant at Kraków-Płaszów. Since the spring of 1943, he had been accumulating money and goods which he sent westwards, often back to his wife and children or the offices of his parents' publishing firm in Vienna. This activity became even more frenzied at the camp as it became clear that it would be dismantled in 1944. And one of the reasons why Schindler was able to convince Goeth to allow him to move his factory and workers westwards into Czechoslovakia was that this action would provide Goeth with a smokescreen for also shipping some of his acquired goods westwards. Word of this corrupt activity on Goeth's part reached the authorities within the SS. It was combined with reports of Goeth holding wild drinking parties at the camp with his mistress Ruth Irena Calder and excessive brutality towards the inmates. The latter action was not criticized on humanitarian grounds. It was simply believed that Goeth should not have been killing workers who were still fit and healthy to be used as slave labor. And these accusations combined were enough to have him removed from his position as commandant of Kraków-Płaszów on the 13th of September 1944. He was sent back to Berlin to be prosecuted, but as the war effort was becoming ever more desperate, the charges were simply dropped in the winter of 1944 and he was released. Goeth had presided over the expansion of the camp at Kraków-Płaszów as well as its darkest days in 1943 and 1944. But now it was nearing its end. administration of the camp had been placed in the hands of SS Obersturmführer Arnold Büscher following Goeth's departure. Under Büscher, the mass deportations which had begun under Goeth in the summer of 1944 continued until there were just a few thousand inmates and guards operating there by the early winter of 1944. The final flurry of activity centered on exhuming the remains of the thousands of bodies of individuals who had been executed in the camp during Goeth's reign of terror. These were dug up and their remains burnt on mass pyres. Similar scenes of SS officers attempting to destroy the evidence of the mass murders which had occurred at the concentration camps were seen throughout Eastern and Central Europe in the closing months of 1944. Finally, in January 1945, the few remaining camp authorities learned that the Soviets were closing on Krakow. Accordingly, they dismantled some of the last parts of the camps and fled. Unlike other camps where buildings, fences, guard towers, and even considerable numbers of prisoners were found, when the Soviets arrived on the 20th of January 1945, they found little sign of any concentration camp at all having been at Kraków-Płaszów. As all of this was occurring, Goeth was moving wildly around Central Europe. Following the dropping of the charges against him and his release, Goeth's primary concern was to ensure that the ill-gotten wealth he had acquired through his corrupt dealings at Kraków-Płaszów was preserved. Accordingly, in the early spring of 1945, he was traveling around Central Europe, locating large shipments of goods which had been sent from eastern Poland. This included a visit to Oskar Schindler's new factory in Czechoslovakia to try to retrieve some of what had been sent there during the relocation of the factory. However, as he was attempting these actions, Goeth was taken ill and ended up in a hospital initially for some chronic stomach problems he was having. But then he was subsequently moved to an SS medical facility where he was deemed to be mentally unfit. As a result, as it entered the late spring of 1945, Goeth was being detained in a mental institution in Bavaria, where he had spent so many years a decade earlier in exile. It was here he would witness the last stages of the war. The Second World War in Europe had entered its death throes in the winter of 1944. As the snow set in December, the Western Allies were preparing to build up their forces in Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeast France for a major offensive into Western Germany in the late winter. A final push by Hitler to counterattack into the Bastogne region saw some brief reverses for the Allies, but eventually the Battle of the Bulge ended in Allied victory in January 1945. Moreover, the concentration of some of Germany's last armies in Western Germany to attempt the counteroffensive drew resources away from the Eastern Front, and as the Russians moved into northwest Poland and northeast Germany in the opening months of 1945, they did so with remarkable speed. It was now a race to Berlin for the Allies. The Russians got there first, and it was they who laid siege to the city in the spring of 1945. Finally, surrounded and unwilling to surrender, Hitler killed himself in the Reich Chancellery bunker on the 30th of April 1945. His successor as head of the Nazi state, Joseph Goebbels, followed his example the following day. Exactly 1 week later, the chief of the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel, signed the official surrender of Germany, bringing the war in Europe to a conclusion. Goeth was a marked man in the aftermath of the war. The Americans, British and Russians had determined in the course of 1944 and early 1945 that there should not be excessive retribution sought against the German people in the aftermath of the war. Many Germans were simply innocent bystanders of a regime which had seized power with roughly the support of just 1/3 of the country in 1933. Moreover, even those who had fought in the Wehrmacht between 1939 and 1945 were more often than not young men who had been conscripted into service or who had shown minimal adherence to the Nazi ideological stance. Fewer still were guilty of actual war crimes or of having committed the worst atrocities associated with the regime. However, this clemency would only extend so far. Those who were at the top of the German government or who had been involved in committing war crimes were to be prosecuted to the full extent, while the SS, of which Goeth was a senior member, were all to be charged with crimes, as the most ideological branch of the Nazi Party and also the organization which had overseen the concentration camps and the mass murder of millions of Jewish people, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and other political dissenters. As such, Goeth would be prosecuted if captured. It did not take long for him to be apprehended, and there was no flight or attempt to evade capture. The former commandant of Kraków-Płaszów was still being held in a mental institution in Bavaria, and he was arrested there by the United States military. Goeth had donned the uniform of an ordinary rank-and-file German soldier in order to cover up his identity as a senior SS officer. As a result, he was not immediately detained as somebody who was to be prosecuted for war crimes and was sent to Dachau concentration camp nearby, which had been repurposed by the Allies as a holding center for German soldiers while they were being investigated to see if they were to be tried on any charges. Here he was finally identified by one Józef Jewkowicz. Jewkowicz had met Goeth several years earlier, in early 1943, when the Kraków-Płaszów camp was first being expanded after Goeth's arrival. At that time, Goeth had once pointed his gun at the teenage Jewkowicz's head. He survived only because a Jewish policeman there assaulted the teenager and then told Goeth to save his bullet because Jewkowicz was dead. Now, nearly 3 years later, he identified the man who had once nearly killed him. And once the Allies knew who he was, Goeth was extradited to Poland for prosecution. Goeth was sent to Poland in 1946 with Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, during much of the period of the Holocaust, while the major surviving leaders of the Nazi regime itself, such as Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, were being tried at the main war crimes trial in Nuremberg in Germany. Individuals such as Höss and Goeth, who had run the concentration camps on Polish soil and murdered hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens, were to be tried in Poland. Accordingly, Goeth's trial commenced in Warsaw on the 27th of August 1946. It lasted just 10 days. The Goeth that entered court was different to the one who had been arrested in Germany a year earlier. During the war, he had gained a lot of weight and drank heavily while he oversaw the camp at Kraków-Płaszów. The very fact that he had been admitted to a mental institution in the dying stages of the war is evidence enough of his shattered state of mind in early 1945. But as he entered the courtroom in Warsaw, he was more composed and had determined to provide his own defense and cross-examine witnesses himself. Nevertheless, there was no doubt from the very beginning that Goeth was going to be found guilty. The indictment, after all, directly accused him of being responsible for murdering at least 8,000 people at Kraków-Płaszów and other locations such as the Kraków ghetto. The prosecution called 70 witnesses over 10 days, many of which provided damning evidence of Goeth's actions at Kraków-Płaszów and elsewhere. Unlike Höss, who freely admitted during his trial that he had done what he did at Auschwitz, but who based his defense on the argument that he was simply following orders, Goeth consistently tried to deny the truth of the claims made against him. One of his arguments was that individuals were only shot at the camp if they were found to be in possession of explosives. It was all a paltry display, and even the few people that Goeth called as witnesses in his defense instead corroborated the prosecution witnesses' statements about Goeth's brutality. It was no surprise when, on the 5th of September, the court found Goeth guilty of all charges and sentenced him to be hanged. The execution was carried out just 8 days later. He was hanged on the grounds of the Kraków-Płaszów labor camp on the 13th of September 1946, after which his body was cremated and the ashes thrown into the Vistula River. He was survived by his wife and 2 surviving children. Annie Goeth had earlier applied for a divorce. He also had an illegitimate child, Monika Hertwig, through his affair with Ruth Calder. Ruth continued to defend Goeth and his actions for decades to come before committing suicide in 1983. But what of Goeth's binary opposite at Kraków-Płaszów? Oskar Schindler was briefly a fugitive after the war. Some of the Jewish people whose lives he had saved prepared letters for him to carry with him, attesting to his actions, but his fear was of falling into Russian hands. As such, he set off westwards with little more than the clothes on his back, having spent all the profits from his factory on bribes and black market goods earlier. Eventually, he and his wife made it to the American lines, and arrangements were made for a pardon. They settled down in Bavaria in the autumn of 1945, but much of the remainder of Schindler's life was turbulent. He suffered several business reverses, emigrated to Argentina with his wife in 1949, but then returned to Germany later without her after going bankrupt in 1958. A further bankruptcy followed back in Germany in 1963, as well as a heart attack, and continued poor health thereafter. However, Schindler was able to survive through these years based largely on donations from several of the Jewish people whose lives he had saved, and with whom he had maintained contacts over the years. When he died in October 1974, his body was taken to Jerusalem, where he was buried on Mount Zion. It would be hard to find another figure who stood in such absolute contrast to Amon Goeth. Amon Goeth was amongst the most brutal of the senior and mid-ranking members of the Nazi regime and the SS. What is perhaps striking about this is that there was not an abundance of evidence of how brutal his tenure as commandant of Kraków-Płaszów would be during his earlier life, the only child of a well-to-do couple who ran a prosperous Viennese publishing house. He certainly exhibited a rebellious streak from a young age, but there were few signs of overt brutality, although his political actions became more and more extreme as the years went by. We do not find him engaging in acts of overt violence throughout the late 1920s, while his terrorist activities in the 1930s were acts of direct political violence rather than exhibitions of pure sadism. Indeed, there were even significant periods of time during which he worked within the family business, and for nearly 3 years between 1934 and 1937, he effectively left the SS and was not an active member of the organization. Thereafter, when the war broke out, he performed several largely administrative roles before being transferred east to work in the growing network of officials charged with incarcerating Poland's Jews and either setting them to work as slave labor or deporting them to the death camps. It was during these years, in the early 1940s, that the already ideologically radical Amon developed the brutal streak which would characterize his reign at Kraków-Płaszów. In Poland during the early 1940s, he observed his immediate superiors, figures such as Odilo Globocnik, terrorized the Jewish people over whose lives they exercised so much authority. Consequently, Goeth's time in Katowice and Lublin acted as a macabre training school for him to acquire the brutality which he deployed at Kraków-Płaszów. Here he dehumanized the thousands of Jewish inmates and murdered people savagely on a whim, while others were beaten and tortured. All were psychologically traumatized by Goeth and his impulsive violence. Yet his reign at Kraków-Płaszów also attests to the hypocrisy of the upper ranks of the SS. Before Kraków-Płaszów was fully dismantled, its commandant was arrested for having profited extensively himself from the running of the camp, rather than filtering the camp's profits to the Nazi regime back in Berlin. Moreover, his reign there is lent a darker hue when it stands beside the noble actions of Oskar Schindler and his efforts to save as many of the Jews of Kraków-Płaszów as he could. What do you think of Amon Goeth? Was he psychologically unbalanced all along? And does this explain some of his behavior? Or was he more of an ideological Nazi committed to the xenophobic policies of the Third Reich? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Hello guys, the People Profiles and the History Chronicles have joined forces, so as well as the fantastic long-form documentaries you get here on the People Profiles, the team are also producing short-form documentaries on the History Chronicles, on everything from nightly orders to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as well as a range of biographies from history's best, worst and most interesting people. Check out the link in the video description, subscribe, and thanks for watching.